The year was 42 AH, and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan led his army towards Kufa. The civil war with Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu was over. Muawiyah was preparing to occupy Ali's former capital. As his armies approached Kufa in Iraq, Muawiyah received word a new rebellion had sprung up within the city. However, these rebels were not devoted to Ali ibn Abi Talib. They were the Khawarij, who opposed both Muawiyah and Ali. Now, Muawiyah had expected some resistance while occupying Kufa. After all, the city had been Ali's headquarters for almost 4 years. And even as his armies closed in on Iraq in the last few months of Ali's life, Muawiyah knew that taking the city wouldn't be easy. Everyone expected a long, bloody struggle if Muawiyah invaded Kufa. But then Ali was assassinated by one of the Khawarij. After Ali's death, his son Hassan became the caliph, but Hassan had no desire to continue his father's war with Muawiyah, and he didn't really trust the Iraqis either. So Hassan did the wise thing. He secured safe passage for himself and his family. He gave up his claim to the caliphate, to the khilafat, to Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, and he retired to the city of his birth, that is, Medina. So now it was up to Muawiyah to deal with the madness, with the craziness that was in Iraq. Muawiyah's capital, that is Damascus in what is now Syria, was free from this scourge of the Khawarij, and he never really had to deal with them. In fact, much of Muawiyah's success was because of the stability in Syria. Before the Muslims actually finalized their conquest of Syria in the Battle of Yarmouk many years earlier, it had been a Roman province, or really a Byzantine province, for a long time. Unlike these new Iraqi cities like Kufa and Basra, the Syrians were comfortable with a central government. Now, even though Muawiyah never had to deal directly with the Khawarij, he was aware of the mischief that they have caused in Kufa. The Khawarij were a really strange breed. Outwardly, they were pious Muslims dedicated to a life of devotion and worship. But they believed that any Muslim who disagreed with them was a munafiq, or a traitor to the faith. And they believed that slaying, that killing the munafiq, the munafiqun, was a sacred duty. For Muawiyah, dealing with the Khawarij was going to be much more complicated than his dealings with Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu. Muawiyah and Ali's conflict began with the murder of the third righteous caliph, Uthman ibn Affan radiyallahu anhu. Muawiyah and Uthman were cousins in a way. They both belonged to Mecca's powerful Umayyad clan. Ali ibn Abi Talib assumed the khilafat after Uthman's murder, and he insisted that the Muslim elite give him bay'ah, or the Pledge of Allegiance. And most of them complied, but some did so reluctantly. Others, however, like Muawiyah, completely resisted and refused. At the time of Uthman's death, Muawiyah was the governor of Syria. He refused to give Ali the bay'ah until his cousin's murder was avenged. As the months passed and tensions escalated, both sides prepared for war. Muawiyah was furious that many of Uthman's opponents had attained high positions in Ali's administration. Ali ibn Abi Talib, for his part, he insisted that he could not concentrate on finding Uthman's killers until Muawiyah and the other holdouts swore allegiance to him. Now, in the beginning of this conflict between Ali and Muawiyah, Ali started off with much more territory and many more men than Muawiyah. But Ali had many things going against him, and he made several mistakes. His biggest mistake was going to war against Aisha radiyallahu anha, the Prophet's widow, at the Battle of the Camel. And even though he defeated Aisha radiyallahu anha, Ali's reputation and support suffered immensely. After the Battle of the Camel, Ali changed his capital from Medina to Kufa in what is now Iraq. And he clashed with Muawiyah for the first time at the Battle of Siffin in Syria. And Muawiyah was close to losing this battle when his trusted advisor Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu negotiated a ceasefire. In the terms of the ceasefire, Ali and Muawiyah agreed to have two men arbitrate and decide how best to resolve the conflict. But many of Ali's followers opposed this idea. Those who opposed arbitration separated from Ali, declaring that both he and Muawiyah were munafiqun, that is, traitors to the faith. And they vowed to destroy the corrupt Muslim leadership and establish a new era of righteous Islamic rule. These Khawarij, as they soon came to be known, put Ali in a difficult spot. He was reluctant to fight against them as they used to be his own soldiers. However, they still posed an imminent threat, and they were forcing Ali to deal with both an external enemy in Muawiyah and an internal enemy in the Khawarij. But eventually, these Khawarij, their actions grew so bold and so outrageous that Ali had no choice but to engage them in battle. Ali first fought the Khawarij at the Battle of Nahrawan and nearly wiped them out, and he destroyed all but 9 of them. But those 9 would be enough to disrupt everything. Those 9 survivors escaped the battlefield and hatched a plot to kill Muawiyah, Ali, and Amr ibn al-As at the same time. Muawiyah and Amr ibn al-As escaped the Khawarij plot, but Ali was not so lucky. Ali was assassinated, and his death cleared the way for Muawiyah to negotiate directly with his son, that is Ali's son, Hassan ibn Ali. Hassan abdicated, and now Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan was the caliph, and he was moving in to occupy Kufa. However, these Khawarij still posed a problem for Muawiyah. Politically and militarily, Muawiyah had to occupy Kufa. He had to establish his authority over Ali's former stronghold. This is something that he just had to do if he wanted to unite the Ummah. However, he also wanted to avoid as much violence as possible. He didn't want to antagonize Ali's city, that is Ali's capital, Kufa, any more than he absolutely had to. So when he realized the Khawarij were preparing to rise up against him in Kufa, he sent a single cavalry after them, hoping that that would be enough to defeat them. But like many others before him and after him, Muawiyah underestimated the Khawarij. He was stunned and disgusted when the Khawarij defeated and nearly wiped out his cavalry. Muawiyah was not about to risk any more of his soldiers in this debacle. Instead, he had a better idea. He sent a message to the chiefs of Kufa and told them that the Khawarij are from your people and they are your responsibility. Deal with them or I will unleash my armies on Kufa, and I make no guarantees for your safety. Without Ali or his son Hassan to lead them, the people of Kufa knew that they didn't stand a chance against Muawiyah's forces. They begged the Khawarij to lay down their arms and rejoin the city. When that didn't work, the Arab chiefs, that is the Ashraf, which is plural for Sharif, the Ashraf organized an army and met the Khawarij on the battlefield. Many of these Khawarij were actually surprised that their own people had turned against them. And these Khawarij who didn't want to fight their own people, they gave up, laid down their arms, and returned to their homes. Those that did not were destroyed. Mughirah ibn Shu'ba. Muawiyah needed a skilled hand to govern Kufa. He wanted somebody capable like Amr ibn al-As, who was now the governor of Egypt. But Amr ibn al-As was the governor of Egypt, so he wasn't really available, so Muawiyah had to choose the next best thing. Muawiyah tapped Amr ibn al-As's son, Abdullah ibn Amr, to be his first governor of Kufa. And Muawiyah would have been satisfied with this had he not been approached by a man named Mughirah ibn Shu'ba. Just like Muawiyah and Amr ibn al-As and Ali ibn Abi Talib, Mughirah ibn Shu'ba was a Sahaba, or a companion of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Mughirah ibn Shu'ba was from Ta'if, roughly 40 miles east of Mecca, and he had accepted Islam after the Prophet migrated to Medina. Mughirah was described as a tall man who had lost one of his eyes at the Battle of Yarmouk during the reign of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. Mughirah ibn Shu'ba had remained neutral during the conflict between Ali and Muawiyah, and he did not participate in any of their battles, and he remained neutral during the arbitration as well. But now that the hostilities were over, Mughirah ibn Shu'ba was hoping to attain some sort of position within Muawiyah's administration. And when he learned that Muawiyah had chosen Amr ibn As's son as governor of Kufa, he saw an opportunity. He approached Muawiyah and said, "You've put yourself between the jaws of a lion. Syria is between the father in Egypt and the son in Iraq." I want to reiterate that all of this is coming from Tariq al-Tabari. You may not like the way some of this sounds, but again, this is Tariq al-Tabari. I'm just reporting to you what he wrote in his history. Now, even though Muawiyah trusted Amr ibn As, who was his governor of Egypt, he understood the potential danger of being stuck between the father and the son, and he knew what men could do for power. So he immediately deposed Amr's son and named Mughirah ibn Shu'ba as the governor of Kufa instead. And when Amr ibn As learned of this, he met with Muawiyah and talked with him and convinced him to at least put a check on Mughirah. It's strange how these companions are kind of plotting against each other, at least according to Tariq al-Tabari. Allah knows best if this really happened. We always have to understand that Tariq al-Tabari was written during the reign of the Abbasids, and the Abbasids had overthrown the Umayyads, and so some people speculate that al-Tabari may have biased some of his writings in order to paint the Umayyads as being maybe a little bit worse than they really were. Allah knows best. But also much of his sources, much of his information were from Shia sources, and the Shiites definitely didn't like the Umayyads. They probably hated the Umayyads even more than the Abbasids did. Allah knows best how accurate some of this is, but I'm just reporting the news as it comes. Allah knows best, once again. Amr tried to convince Muawiyah to put a check on Mughirah, and he said that Mughirah would empty Kufa of its entire treasury if it was left alone. So to appease Amr ibn As and limit Mughirah ibn Shu'ba's power in Kufa, Muawiyah appointed Amr's son as the finance minister of Kufa. And not surprisingly, Mughirah ibn Shu'ba wasn't particularly happy about this, but there really wasn't anything he could do about it. Muawiyah's government. So as we can see, the empire, the Khilafat, the Muslim Ummah, was united under Muawiyah's rule, but there was still a lot of division. Even though the Arab Muslims were the rulers, they were the minorities in many of these areas that they were ruling over. This was most evident in Syria, which was actually Muawiyah's stronghold. The province known as Syria was not limited to the republic that we know of today. The region called Asham, that's the Arabic word for Syria, included modern-day Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and even some parts of Saudi Arabia. During Muawiyah's reign, Syria was divided into 4 smaller districts. Palestine was one, Jordan was another, Damascus, and Homs. And each of these smaller districts had a governor answerable directly to Muawiyah. These sub-governors, they collected tax revenue and sent it to Damascus. Outside of Syria, however, the taxation policies were very inconsistent. It was up to the local administration to establish and manage their finances, and some provinces did better than others depending on the governor in office. The wealth didn't really flow from the outer provinces into Syria to be redistributed at Muawiyah's whim, as we would normally think of modern taxation policies. All of Syria's tax revenue originated in Syria, within Asham. Most Syrians at this time were still Christian, actually. It would take several generations for the Muslims to become a majority, and even today, there are still large pockets of Christians and Jews living in Syria. And despite the potential conflict of a Muslim minority ruling over a Christian majority, there were actually very few religious clashes in Syria during Muawiyah's reign. His jizya, or non-Muslim tax, for lack of a better phrase, was reported to be very modest and stable. And because Muawiyah tried to abide by the injunctions of the Quran, he did not demolish churches or monasteries. He did not prevent public Christian worship. And there's also evidence that new churches were built during his reign. One other thing that contributed to this stability and at least satisfaction with Muawiyah's rule was that some Christian sects, S-E-C-T-S, some Christian sects that the Byzantine Empire persecuted flourished under Muawiyah. Monophysite and Nestorian Christians were finally able to worship openly and freely, something that they couldn't do under the Byzantines. And unlike the Byzantines, Muawiyah didn't play games by trying to play one group of Christians against another. Muawiyah even posted Muslim soldiers to guard Christians during their worship services. The primary setback for Christianity during Muawiyah's reign was that they could no longer depend on government support. The actual government wasn't going to give these Christian monasteries money to build more churches. This was especially difficult for those Christian groups that had been aligned with the dominant Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople at that time. These Christians now had to depend more and more on private donations. And even this began to suffer over the decades and over the years as conversion to Islam began to increase. Another factor contributing to Syria's success was Muawiyah's preference for diplomacy over force. When he needed to convince a tribal leader to go along with him, Muawiyah would invite him to his palace in Damascus. He would feed him, entertain him, and shower him with gifts. Muawiyah would flatter the chief, and he would offer to help out with any of the problems the chief might be facing. And in this way, Muawiyah won the trust and the loyalty of the Syrian nobility. There are even reports from Christian contemporaries describing Muawiyah in these glowing terms, saying that he was the first among equals. He was not ostentatious. He did not wear a crown. He never built any monuments in his name. And all of that, as far as we know, is true. Allah knows best, but so far, we have not found any monuments built in Muawiyah's name. And unlike the later Umayyad caliphs, Muawiyah was essentially a son of the desert. He was born in Mecca, and he had witnessed the rise of Islam and the Arabs over the years. And even though his father, Abu Sufyan, had once been a bitter enemy of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he saw Islam rise from humble beginnings as a persecuted minority to become the ruling force over millions of people across 3 continents. Muawiyah knew much about the strength of Islam lay in these simple desert roots, and he never forgot that. And that was how he preferred to govern the empire, in a very simple and straightforward way. Simple, straightforward, uncomplicated. And so Muawiyah's administration was very much the same. It was not very sophisticated. Now, we've already described the division of Syria, but now let's also discuss the division of the actual empire, the Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate. The empire was divided into 5 large provinces. There was Syria, which, as we mentioned, included primarily Jordan and Palestine. Egypt, which included North Africa, not just Egypt itself, but also pretty much North Africa. Basra, which included most of southeastern Persia. Kufa, which included most of Iraq and Central Asia, and finally the Hijaz, which included the Arabian Peninsula. Each region was further divided into smaller districts, and most of Muawiyah's governors had sub-governors ruling over these smaller districts. But these boundaries were not fixed. Administrative regions shifted depending on Muawiyah's preferences or the needs of the moment. Sometimes he combined 2 large regions under one governor, and other times he split a large region between multiple governors. Mughirah in Kufa. Just like the Muslim empire was divided, Kufa was also divided when Mughirah ibn Shu'ba became the governor. Though the people of Kufa had given their pledge, their bay'ah to Muawiyah, their hearts were still with Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. and Mughirah ibn Shu'ba knew the threat of the Khawarij was still present. Mughirah could not expect much assistance from Muawiyah in Syria. Muawiyah generally took a hands-off approach with his officials. Muawiyah expected his governors to handle their own problems. If Damascus had to get involved, that meant that Kufa needed a new governor. Muawiyah was known to replace governors in a heartbeat if they proved to be ineffective. Furthermore, Mughirah knew the people of Kufa were not yet comfortable with Muawiyah as their caliph. Things were fine in Syria and Egypt where Muawiyah and Amr ibn al-As ruled. However, in these other areas, there was still a lot of resentment against Muawiyah. The people of Kufa, Basra, and even the Arabian Peninsula were not happy that he was in charge. They accepted Muawiyah because they were tired of fighting and there were no other viable choices, but they didn't really want him there. So with these problems in mind, Mughirah took a very conciliatory approach to governing Kufa. He did not pressure the people to acknowledge their loyalty to Muawiyah verbally, and because of this, he was more or less accepted by the people. But let's not be confused, Mughirah ibn Shu'ba was not a fool. He did force those with sketchy or questionable loyalties to attend all the public prayers. Their willingness to pray behind Mughirah ibn Shu'ba or his representative, that sort of demonstrated their submission to the regime. And Mughirah's precautions would prove valid because in 43 AH, 2 years after he became governor, a group of Khawarij hatched another rebellion. This time the leader was a man named Ibn Ulifah, who began holding meetings with other like-minded Khawarij rebellious type individuals. These Khawarij devoted themselves to two things. First, they promised to fight the munafiqun, that is, the traitors to the faith. And by this they meant Muawiyah and his administration. Second, they promised to kill the people of the Qibla, or in other words, average Muslims who did not join their cause. Mughirah ibn Shu'ba had spies, and his spies soon found out about these suspicious gatherings, and so his police raided one of their meetings and arrested several of the Khawarij. However, the ringleader, Ibn Ulifah, who we mentioned earlier, and several others escaped. They learned to be more careful and secretly started meeting at a friend's house in Hira, about 3.5 miles from Kufa. But eventually they had to move again as their meetings grew larger and attracted more unwanted attention. This time, they moved to the house of one of Ibn Ulifah's relatives. Soon talk of a Khawarij rebellion was spreading out all over the city, but Mughirah's spies had lost track of them. So Mughirah decided to pressure the Kufans to turn in the rebels. One evening after the Salat, after the prayers, Mughirah gave a speech to the chiefs of Kufa. He warned them of the dangers of rebellion and its repercussions. He advised them to look within their clans and their families and root out this evil before things got worse. And then he ended his speech with a threatening tone. He said, "You have heard what I said, so let every man among the chiefs satisfy me regarding his people. If not, then by Allah, I will surely change from someone you like into someone you hate." Now, the chief of Ibn Ulifah's clan, Ibn Ulifah is once again the leader of this new Khawarij group. The chief of Ibn Ulifah's clan was a staunch supporter of Ali ibn Abi Talib. But he was an honorable man who kept his promises. He had gave his bay'ah, he had submitted to Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, and even though he didn't really like the situation, he was going to abide by his promise. And also, furthermore, this chief, he hated the Khawarij. So he promised Mughirah that he would uphold his bay'ah, his pledge to Muawiyah, and he would kill any Khawarij that he found in his clan. So when Ibn Ulifah heard this chief's, his own chief's declaration, he decided to move again. And even though he ultimately planned to kill any Muslim who didn't side with him, he didn't want to bring harm directly to his people. So later that night, Ibn Ulifah and his followers, his Khawarij followers, they moved to what is now near modern-day Baghdad. And from there, he wrote a letter to the governor of Madain. We'll discuss Madain and what that is in just a few moments, inshallah. So in the most audacious matter, Ibn Ulifah threatened the governor of Madain with destruction if he did not join the Khawarij cause. Here's the gist of that letter according to At-Tabari. I summon you to the Book of Allah and to the Sunnah of His Prophet and the rule of Abu Bakr and Umar. I also call you to disavow Uthman and Ali for innovation in religion and abandoning the Quran. If you accept, then you are a sensible man. And if you do not, you've run out of excuses and you should prepare for war. Ibn Ulifah sent this letter with his youngest follower, a young boy not even 14 years old, and the governor just scoffed at the letter, but he did send it on to Mughirah nonetheless. So remember, Mughirah was the governor of Kufa, so Madain was within the district of Kufa, and so this was one of Mughirah's sub-governors. Now this is exactly what Mughirah was looking for. Now he knew where the Khawarij were located, and he could focus on bringing them to justice. Shiites and Khawarij. With very few exceptions, the people of Kufa at this time were either Shia or Khawarij. They were either supporters of Ali or supporters of rebellion and chaos. They shared a common enemy, but these two groups couldn't have been further apart. The Shia and the Khawarij, they both hated Muawiyah and the other Umayyads, and their hatred was based on both historical and political factors. They both viewed the Umayyads as opportunists who had opposed Prophet Muhammad ﷺ from the very beginning. And even though the Umayyads did accept Islam early on, particularly Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, the vast majority of the Umayyad clan did not convert to Islam until Prophet Muhammad ﷺ conquered Mecca. Muawiyah and his father, Abu Sufyan, they sort of fell into this category. Abu Sufyan had led the opposition against Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for many years. And this made Muawiyah's ascendance to the Caliph, to the Caliphate, even more unthinkable. While most Khawarij and many Shia accepted the rule of Abu Bakr and Umar as legitimate, they felt things started to go wrong with Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. Remember, we're talking about the Shia of that time, not the Shia of today. The Shia and the Khawarij felt that Muawiyah perpetuated this injustice by assuming the caliphate when there were so many more qualified individuals. Now, despite these similarities, the Khawarij and the Shia had many more differences. Their primary difference revolved around who should be the caliph. The Shia believed the caliphate was hereditary. It should be passed along to someone from Prophet Muhammad's lineage, or at the very least, someone from his clan, that is, Banu Hashim. However, the Khawarij did not consider hereditary to be a vital factor. Like most Muslims of this time, and even today, they believed leadership should be based on merit and ability. Another striking difference between the Khawarij and the Shia was their identity. The Khawarij then and now were not really a sect. Some leaned more towards the Sunni version of Islam, some towards the Shia version of Islam. The Khawarij more or less represented an ideology. The ideology that the Khawarij represented was that the Ummah had been corrupted and it was the government's fault. And the only way to fix this corruption was the removal of the government and a return to the pure practice of Islam. And this ideology is echoed in many Muslim terrorist groups today. The Sharia, the Shiites, the Shia, however, they are a sect of Islam. What started out as a political dispute between Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan has now morphed into a theological split. While Sunnis and Shias share many of the same religious rituals and concepts, there are many theological differences. And the primary one among them is the status of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. For the Shia, Ali was the true successor of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he held a higher rank than the rest of humanity. For the Sunnis, however, Ali was a highly respected companion of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's it. No more and no less. Regarding location, most Shia today are concentrated in what was the former strongholds of Ali, that is, Iraq and Persia. And this is why today the three largest Shia majority nations, Iran, Iraq, and Azerbaijan, are all in this area. Now, as an ideology, the Khawarij were not limited to any specific geographical region, but they do follow a general pattern of development. People with Khawarij tendencies will make hijrah, or migration that is, to an area dominated by like-minded people. There they're going to prepare for jihad against the Muslim establishment. And as a result, because of this pattern of behavior, most of the victims of Khawarij violence is usually other Muslims. This is another pattern we find often with modern so-called Muslim terrorist groups. Lower Mesopotamia. The geography around Kufa presented both an opportunity and an obstacle in Mughirah ibn Shu'ba's pursuit of the Khawarij. This was the eastern edge of one of the most ancient cultures on earth. This region that was bounded by the Tigris and the Euphrates River was crisscrossed with canals, providing life-giving irrigation and cultivating a rich culture and history. This fertile region forms a crude triangle with Madain to the north and the Persian Gulf to the south, and sandwiched between the hostile Arabian deserts to the west and the formidable Zagros Mountains to the east. This region's fertility, however, led to a high population and several major ancient cities. These included cities like Assur, Babylon, Nineveh, Nippur, and Uruk. Before the Muslim conquests, this fertile region, known today as Lower Mesopotamia, was the breadbasket for the former Sasanian Empire, and it was the home of their capital, Ctesiphon, known to the Arabs as Madain. Ctesiphon, or Madain as it was known during the time that we're talking about now, Muawiyah's reign, Ctesiphon was once a key city along the famous Silk Road. The Silk Road was a network of trade routes that connected the silk-producing cities of China with the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. However, with the Muslim conquests that really began during the reign of Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu, the political and economic power shifted west away from Persia to Medina and then later on to Damascus. And even though neither Kufa nor Basra were on the Silk Road, both of these cities were strategically important to the Muslim empire, to the Muslim Khilafat. Kufa, which sat on the western banks of the Tigris River, was the gateway between Arabia and Persia. And Basra gave the Muslims easy access to the Persian Gulf. Long before the Muslims came along, the Persians recognized and understood the bounties of this region, and they called it Bohu Dadati, or gift of God. The Abbasids, who would succeed the Umayyads, they would build their capital less than 20 miles from the ruins of Ctesiphon, that is the former capital of the Sassanid dynasty, and the Umayyads would call this new capital city Madinatus Salam, or the City of Peace. However, that ancient name, Bohu Dadati, that would stick, and by the time of the Crusades, Bogu Dadati had been Arabized to Baghdad. Ma'akil and the Khawarij. Mughirah ibn Shu'ba knew this area around Madain very well, and he appointed a local chieftain named Ma'akil ibn Qais to find the Khawarij. Mughirah, he understood Iraqi politics. He knew Ali's supporters, that is the Shia to Ali. He knew that the Shia despised Muawiyah, but he also knew that they hated the Khawarij even more. And so he instructed Ma'akil to include only the Sharia to Ali in his band. This would make them even more determined to destroy the Khawarij. So Ma'akil began his expedition to root out the Khawarij threat. He began his expedition with 3,000 men. But by the time they set off, Ibn Ulifah and the Khawarij had moved on yet again. Ma'akil instinctively, he kind of knew, he could guess that their next move was going to be towards the coast. So he dispatched a cavalry of about 300 men towards the Persian Gulf, and sure enough, they caught up with Ibn Ulifah and the Khawarij just outside of Basra. Ma'akil didn't have any illusions that his cavalry could actually defeat the Khawarij. He was just hoping that his cavalry would pin them down long enough for the bulk of his forces to arrive. And the next day, Ma'akil received word that his cavalry had engaged the Khawarij and were locked in a stalemate. Ma'akil then chose 700 of his fastest horsemen and led them on a high-speed charge to the coast, and they reached Basra by sunset that day. With nearly 1,000 men, Ma'akil got overconfident and, like many others, underestimated the Khawarij. He would learn a hard lesson about the people he was up against. The Khawarij, undeterred by being outnumbered 3-1, they launched a surprise attack against Ma'akil. They scattered his men, and it was all he could do just to rally them and regain some semblance of order. Ma'akil ordered his men to dismount and withdraw their weapons, and then he organized them in ranks and began several hours of hard fighting against the Khawarij. Eventually, Ma'akil's greater numbers started to take the advantage, and by nightfall, the Khawarij had been pushed back to a row of houses in a nearby village. By this time, however, the rest of Ma'akil's forces had finally arrived on the scene. Remember, he started off with about 3,000. However, the Khawarij were hiding in the village, and it was too dark to really search for them. So Ma'akil decided to rest his men for the night and resume the battle in the morning. Now, even though his men slept, Ma'akil, he could not. He just kept worrying about another surprise attack from the Khawarij. And by the time morning came, the Khawarij had yet again slipped away. Frustrated that he lost them again, Ma'akil prepared his men for the pursuit, and he sent his cavalry again, doubling the number of soldiers this time. Ibn Ulifah, he led his Khawarij away from Ma'akil back towards Kufa. But to his surprise, Ma'akil's cavalry had caught up to them yet again. They clashed yet again, this time near a village called Jarjaraya, just northeast of Kufa. And once again, Ibn Ulifah's men initially defeated the Kufan cavalry. But then the Kufans rallied, and they forced the Khawarij to retreat across a bridge to the other side of the Tigris River. Ibn Ulifah was now running out of options, and he was tired of playing this cat and mouse game. Ibn Ulifah wasn't afraid to die, but he wanted to die in splendid glory. If he could just separate the Kufan cavalry from Ma'akil's primary infantry force, he might be able to strike a hard blow against them. Ibn Ulifah, he led his men in a frantic charge 20 miles downriver, where they found another bridge, crossed over the Tigris River, and cut the ropes of the bridge. Ibn Ulifah and his men then rode off just as the Kufan cavalry approached the opposite side of the river. Ma'akil and his primary infantry forces were less than 12 miles away and didn't even know that his cavalry was stranded across the river. Ibn Ulifah's plan almost worked. He managed to separate the cavalry from the infantry. And the Khawarij, led by Ibn Ulifah, they did catch Ma'akil and the Kufans by surprise. But Ma'akil, who was an older, stubborn man, he put up a hard resistance against the Khawarij. He unsheathed his sword, and then he rallied his men into ranks, and they fought off wave after wave of Khawarij attacks. Eventually, Ma'akil's cavalry repaired the bridge, crossed the river, and raced in to join the fight against the Khawarij. And now it was over for the Khawarij. The Khawarij were outnumbered, they were outflanked, and they had nowhere to run. So caught between Ma'akil's infantry to the front and Ma'akil's cavalry to the back, the Khawarij were slaughtered. Only 6 of them survived. Muawiyah's next move. Of course, Muawiyah had absolutely nothing to do with this battle between the Kufans and the Khawarij since he was hundreds of miles away in Damascus. However, he did get a report on what happened and the trouble Mughirah ibn Shu'ba had in putting down this rebellion. Unfortunately, things weren't going very well in Basra either. This time, it wasn't the Khawarij who was causing the trouble. Instead, it was Afghan tribesmen in the mountainous regions of northern Khorasan who had rose up in rebellion. At this time, remember, most of the Afghans were not Muslim yet. And as many others would learn throughout the centuries, the Muslims were also learning that conquering the Afghans was not easy to do. Conquering the land was easy. Occupying them and subjugating the people was nearly impossible. Muawiyah's cousin, Abdullah ibn Amir, was currently the governor of Basra, but it was starting to be clear that he just wasn't up to the task. In addition to the rebellion in Afghanistan, Muawiyah was also receiving reports of lawlessness, banditry, and just overall chaos in Basra. Unlike the previous caliphs, however, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan was running out of high-ranking Sahabas to appoint as governors. Most of the still surviving older companions were too old to be effective. His closest friend and advisor, Amr ibn al-As, had died just a few weeks after the start of the Khawarij rebellion in Kufa that we just spoke about with Ibn Ulifah and Ma'akil. Another Sahaba, Muhammad ibn Maslama, radiallahu anhu, who was one of the first people in Medina to accept Islam, had died earlier just that year. Most of the younger companions had either sided with Ali ibn Abi Talib during the Fitna, or they had remained neutral and wanted nothing to do with government. Now, Muawiyah was realizing that Iraq was different. Iraq was just a different place. He couldn't deal with the Iraqis the same way he dealt with the Syrians. He couldn't buy them off with gifts or win their loyalty with flattery and promises. Even his cousin, Uthman ibn Affan, he had also experienced similar problems when he was caliph. The Iraqis were always complaining incessantly about their governors, but they were never satisfied no matter who Uthman put in charge. So it was really no surprise to Muawiyah that those who were involved in Uthman's murder mostly came from Kufa. So Muawiyah was going to have to take a more assertive approach. The Iraqis would have to be physically cowed and spiritually crushed. Fear was not enough for them. He needed someone whose very name would strike terror into their hearts, and he knew just the man for the job. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is season 3 of the Islamic History Podcast, which picks up just after the death of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. This season, inshallah, we're going to cover the reign of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and part of the second Fitna. The second Fitna includes the massacre at Karbala and the war between Ibn Zubayr and the Umayyads, but we're only going to cover the events of the massacre at Karbala during this season. Ibn Zubayr's story is covered in extreme detail in our premium series, Islamic History Exclusive. It's a paid podcast. That's really how I keep the lights on, how I pay for this podcast. How I'm able to give you these free episodes is because of Islamic History Exclusive. Currently, Islamic History Exclusive is only available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our Patreon channel, patreon.com/Islamic History, and it is audio only. However, I do plan to add it to YouTube soon, inshallah. I'm still working on that, but it will be behind a paywall. So in the next episode, inshallah, we will introduce one of Muawiyah's most brutal governors, Ziyad ibn Abihi. Until then, stay tuned for a short clip from our series, which is also on Islamic History Exclusive, our series on the life of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The Knights of the First Crusade. Despite the disaster of the People's Crusade, Pope Urban's call to arms was wildly successful. He had hoped to recruit at most 10,000 soldiers to the cause. But as the word spread through Europe, almost 100,000 people responded. Of these 100,000, there were around 10,000 knights and about 50,000 infantrymen. The remainder were women, children, and other non-combatants. Still, this was more than Pope Urban had ever expected. Pope Urban II also preferred knights, who were lesser nobles and just below royalty. Some of these knights were dukes and counts who would bring along their own military forces. The entire concept of knighthood was still being developed in Europe. While well-trained and experienced, the knights did not belong to a standing army and were often just wealthy farmers. Most of the men who participated in the First Crusade did not have any experience in large-scale warfare. Their previous battle experience usually included sieges against castles and strongholds with lots of hectic raids and some close combat. But these knights had little experience with formal drilling and organized formations. Despite their unsophisticated approach to battle, the knights had developed fighting techniques that suited them well. Every knight had a horse, and they learned to ride while holding a large spear or lance. They had developed the tactic of riding in massed charges against an enemy, which could be quite formidable. Knights usually wore cone-shaped helmets over a chainmail hood. They also wore chainmail shirts over padded vests and an armored breastplate over all of that. This armor offered considerable protection against many attacks but could withstand a hard thrust or blow. In addition to a lance, a knight's arsenal often included a double-edged broadsword about 2 feet in length and a 6-foot-long longbow. A typical longbow could shoot an arrow up to 300 yards. Knights also carried a wooden shield, and some even had rudimentary crossbows. The most important tool a knight had, however, was his horse. A mounted knight had a significant advantage over a similarly skilled foot soldier. The horses of this era were small and would be considered ponies today. Nonetheless, they were very expensive to maintain. A knight often traveled with a squire to care for the horse, 4 or 5 servants who could also act as soldiers, and a second horse to carry equipment. Some of the knights who joined the Crusades were nobles who would become legends in Christian Europe. In addition to Raymond of Toulouse, there was his arch-rival Bohemond of Taranto in southern Italy. Bohemond had become an expert in siege warfare and military strategy while fighting against the Byzantines. Despite his princely status, however, he was almost broke and was hoping to gain wealth and new lands by participating in the Crusades. Bohemond of Taranto was joined by his nephew Tancred of Hauteville, who was also known to speak Arabic. 2 other nobles who joined were Godfrey and Baldwin of Bouillon, a region covering eastern France and western Germany. Godfrey was the Duke of Lower Lorraine, but had little true authority in the area. He and his brother were hoping to get fresh starts by joining the Crusades. As most of the Europeans in the First Crusade came from France, they would be called Franks by their Muslim enemies. This term stuck, and even today, Christian participants in the Crusades are often collectively called Franks regardless of where they originated from. The Crusader army started arriving in Constantinople around November 1096. This was roughly a year after Pope Urban's famous speech in Clermont. The idea was that they would cross the Bosporus Strait and proceed into Asia Minor, most of which was under Muslim control. Emperor Alexius of the Byzantines did not trust the soldiers entering his territory. Like his Muslim rivals, he looked down on Western Europeans and considered them barbarians. He was also more than a little worried they might turn against him at any moment. Hence, he had his soldiers keep a close eye on the Crusaders, wanting them out of his land and into Muslim territory as quickly as possible. The Crusaders expected the emperor to join them and lead them into battle in Jerusalem, but Emperor Alexius had no desire to do so. Capturing Jerusalem was not even part of his original plan. He simply wanted to retake land captured by the Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor. Still, he knew a great opportunity when he saw one. So while he had the Crusaders in his territory, he made them swear to turn over any territory they captured that had once belonged to the empire.